So as you see, assignment 2 goes all the way to mid-November, November 19th, actually November 22nd, right? So it's going to be, you have over a month to do this, like 5 weeks to do this. But please don't put it off. Please don't wait till the last minute. It's a big book. There's a lot of information. It's kind of dense at times, but it's a very important book to read, I think, to understand how we got here. So I broke it up into parts. Right, here's part 1, part 2. Here's the discussion for part 1 and part 2. Here's part 3, King Leopold's Ghost. And I've not published these parts yet for you, part 4 of King Leopold's Ghost, or the part 3 and 4 of the discussion posts, because I haven't quite finished editing them yet. So no, it goes all the way to part 6, and I try to keep them as bite-sized as possible, okay? And it's about 1 week per part. So keep it up just so you can pace yourselves and keep it up. Okay. So I will be opening these up as the days progress. So there's where we are for assignment 2. Assignment 3 will be a look at the 20th century, a look into the long 20th century. And it'll be a lot shorter than this. It'll be by far the shortest part in our 3-part series. Okay. So does that make sense, Hannah? Okay. Yeah, I like your thumbs up. All right. Let's continue. So what I'm going to be discussing today is how did technological innovations of the Industrial Revolutions make the new imperialism possible? Okay. And what this refers to is, if I go to the New Imperialism, part 2, and click it, there's going to be, and scroll down through the directions, there's going to be 3 lectures I will post today and tomorrow. One is about the Industrial Revolution. It'll last about 20 minutes. The next one are going to be about the Opium Wars between Britain and China. And the last one's going to be about how various European countries, specifically the Congo, made treaties with various African nations. All right, and how this allowed at least the legitimacy of the new imperialism to go forward in the eyes of Europeans and Americans. So I'll be posting these 3 lectures today and tomorrow. And here are questions for part 2, pages 61 through 114. Again, get them in, better late than never, but don't fall behind or else it's going to kick your own butt. It's not a good thing. So there's 6 questions for chapter 4, 6 questions for chapters 5, etc. And of course, I give you page numbers, not for all of them, but for many of them, to help you process this, so you're not spending so much time on the boring part of like finding the information, but delving into the information. Okay, there it is. Let me move you over here. There we go. Just make it bigger. So in the 1760s, Europe controlled, at least nominally, about 35% of the world. European colonial expanses, right? Around here, all the things that are colored, right? This is the huge Spanish Empire in the 1760s, right? The big British Empire in the United States and in Canada, and then various European outposts in Africa and Southeast Asia. However, if you fast forward to 1914, right before World War I, and World War I really destroyed the whole colonial project for Europeans in many various ways, and we'll talk about that later. But by 1914, European countries in the United States controlled about 84% of the world, either not maybe direct control, but through colonial dominance. How did this happen? And this is going to be the subject of this 15-minute chat. In the 1700s, European colonists were limited to North and South Africa, and in the equatorial regions of the world, Europeans did not survive because of disease, right? They did not have the tolerance or the immunities of folks who lived there all their life and developed those things. However, that didn't mean that people in the equatorial regions of Africa, that means where the equator is in here, didn't trade with Europeans. For example, in the 1700s, Western Africans and Eastern Africans, I should have put them both, folks in the middle, right, he even says Equatoria, traded gold, ivory, and people, right? They exported Africans from different tribes, right? They didn't export their own people to Europeans in the 1700s. However, this is going to radically change come the 1800s and the industrialization of Western Europe. In the 1800s, there's a boom in coal mining, in railroad building, in all kinds of revolutions on the land and in industry. And I show you this map just to show you the place where you see the most busy stuff, all the red lines and the green spots and the little axes and things. This is where the Industrial Revolution hit most intensely. In other words, these are the areas that developed, right, all the things we can consider modern and industrialized. And I'll chat with you in a second about that. Oh, isn't it? Hello, Karen. I don't see our wonderful student, so I'm just going to continue. Okay, Karen? Okay, thumbs up from Karen. Okay. What did this industrialization in Western Europe look like? Well, here's a famous painting that kind of demonstrates it, right? Look at all these nerdy guys here. And this is one of the first times in which scientists and philosophers are getting statues and commemorative plaques and things made for them because of their scientific innovations. Not only like military leaders and folks like Napoleon were being celebrated with statuary, but now it's the nerdy scientists. And here they are surrounding, framing this image. So Western Europe and the US and many other places went from wind energy to steam, went from horsepower to steam, went from kerosene lights and whale oil lights to electrical power. These are just some of the changes that Western Europe saw. There were also revolutions on the land. And what I mean by that is that before the industrialization of agricultural production, right, all this wheat and all the apples had to be picked by hand, okay? And for example, in 1850, give or take, it took about 60 hours for people to harvest an acre of wheat, right? That is seemingly a long time when you compare it to come the Industrial Revolution and the invention of all these reapers and harvesters, right? It only took 3.3 hours with one guy, 2 horses, and an expensive machine to harvest an acre of wheat. So in other words, it's taking less time, it's cheaper if you could afford the machinery to harvest an acre of wheat. And this was a globalized industry. This is the beginning, the 1700s and 1800s is an uptick in globalized economy, globalized moving of products, etc. For example, McCormick Harvesting Company, based in Chicago, Illinois, was one of the big landowners in the Yucatan Peninsula of Merida, where the capital of Merida, right? If you ever go down to the Yucatan Peninsula, you got to go check out Chichen Itza and Akumal right over here. Back in the days when we used to travel, my family traveled right down here to Akumal. It's beautiful. So let me just get back to the boring history stuff. So this company way up in Chicago owned land way down here. Why is that? Is because in this part of Mexico, henequen, this plant grew readily, and it was a big slave plantation, right? Slavery was illegal in Mexico, but these were largely enslaved Yaqui Indians from northern Mexico who were moved down there to work in these pemmican plantations. Notice the guy with the gun. He does not have a gun to protect themselves from lions and tigers and bears. It's to keep the slave labor in order. So my point here is that it's a globalized economy. Many companies have interests elsewhere and they're importing their product. Another example, and you're going to see a lot of that in the book King Leopold's Ghost. Another example of how the Industrial Revolution allowed new imperialism to happen was the steam engine. And James Watt is credited with creating the steam engine by some, but he was just building on the innovations of many, many other scientists, right? He's given his just due, but it wasn't him alone who came up with this big old contraption to build the internally combusted steam engine. And the steam engine allowed all kinds of revolutions in transportation. For example, no longer did you have to depend on wind, right, to push your ships across the Atlantic or the Pacific or the Indian Ocean. Now you can see these ships are traveling through the Suez Canal using their steam engines. And sure, they still had sails. It was a slow transition to all the way steam. And if there was wind, they'd turn off the steam engine to save energy and put the sails up. So here is the 1869 opening of the Suez Canal. It was a big deal. This is at a time when Egypt was controlled by Britain. So you have this British Egyptian contingent celebrating. And what this Industrial Revolution innovation did was not only it saved time to go to Mumbai, and Mumbai was one of the main ports in British colonial controlled India, called the British Raj, right over here. No longer did you have to sail your steam engine all the way across here. Now sailboat. Now you can take your sailboat / steam engine and go through the Suez Canal. That's another aspect of the Industrial Revolution. Chopping a big canal in the desert between Egypt and Israel, right in here. So it cut down 5,000 miles. So innovations and the steam engine allowed for a huge transportation revolution. Hannah, have you ever been to this part of the world? I'm just sick of myself talking. I have to just chat. No? Okay. Do you want to go? Yes is the answer. Okay. You gotta go. It's good to travel. I miss it. So in the same summer of '69, the same summer in which the Suez Canal was open, the United States connected the east and west coast through the railroads, right? Now you could travel across the United States on these railroads on the steam engine. Okay, so it's a transcontinental transportation revolution. And the railroad served as a tool for many things, right? On one hand, you could transport soldiers quicker. So the railroad in the US West helped the US to conquer Native Americans and to develop it. Here is a famous photo of US buffalo hunters killing the buffalo, right? Because one of the main reasons why buffalo were hunted to near extinction was that many thought it was more humane to kill the Native Americans' source of food and bones and tools than to actually kill the Native Americans. So there was a deliberate a successful policy to wipe out the buffaloes in the US West in the mid-1800s. Similarly, railroads in Africa were used as a tool to conquer Africans, once again, to move troops and to develop it, right? Develop for European colonial exports. You could move product. This is an image of some 4 African miners bringing out copper from a mine in the Congo, in the Belgian Congo. Okay, so railroads facilitated that. You could also transport labor with these tools of the Industrial Revolution. Here are forced laborers being transported in the Belgian Congo. I believe, where's this from? Oh, I did not, right, where? Yeah, I believe it's the Belgian Congo, transporting laborers. And the railroads could also be used for fun, but for whose fun? Right here is a young girl who's the king of a colonial employee in the Congo. And the caption of the photo in 1905 is going visiting her private tram car, and she has her own engine. This one young man is pushing her along the tram lines. Rather disturbing, I think, but there it goes. And just another data point, here is Stanley's image. You all are reading about Stanley in your book. You've been introduced to him. Here is his drawing of steamboats delivering troops to the Congo in 1890 in order to facilitate King Leopold's extraction of rubber and control of the area. But steamboats were also used to transport Europeans. Here is a big old steamboat, and here is this European woman being taken to the steamboat so she can go back to Europe for a trip. The final example, is this the final example? No, my next to last example of demonstrating to you how the Industrial Revolution allowed the new imperialism was innovations in science and innovations in medicine. For example, the equatorial region, right, that is very humid, a lot of mosquitoes, was called the white man's grave for hundreds of years. White man meaning Northern Europeans would die in high numbers when they traveled to this area. For example, in 1832 on the Niger River is right in here, European expedition in 1832, I'm sorry, out of 48 of them, only 9 survived, and they died of malaria. So innovations in science allowed for vaccines to be produced, quinine in this example, in which if you take doses of quinine, it'll create a tolerance in your body to survive malaria. Malaria is a mosquito-borne disease, a mosquito-borne parasite. And here this guy is laughing while these guys are drinking it because, have you ever had to take quinine, Hannah? Have you taken, no? Oh, yeah, it's rough. If you ever go to the equatorial regions of the world, take it at your own peril. It'll mess you up, but it'll help you not die of malaria. So here are European soldiers getting ready to go down to the equator. And where did quinine come from? Well, this is cool. It relates to our assignment 1. It came from Peru. So the Quechua-speaking people of Peru knew that this plant, this medicinal herb called quinine, treated fevers. So the Jesuits, a religious group of Spaniards in Peru, and they were like the educated class, the ones who ran the schools, just as you read in Inez of My Soul. They brought quinine, this herb, to Europe, and it took them 150 years, 250 years, to figure out how to chemically bring out the quinine and use it to help malaria and yellow fever. And it worked. And to this day, if the cure or the help you get over malaria or yellow fever is chinchona. Chinchona is the Quechua word for it. And during the British control of India, there was a massive attempt to try to treat quinine throughout the country, right? Here's a British Indian advertisement for quinine as a malarial treatment in 1927, right? So on one hand, European colonialism brought a lot of resource extraction and exploitation, but it brought, scientific advancement as well, because a lot of equatorial people had to go through a lot of suffering in order to build a tolerance to quinine, to malaria. But here is this effort to get rid of it. And yay science and yay vaccines. All right, and the final example I'm going to give for how the Industrial Revolution helped Europeans and the new imperialism control Africa and equatorial India and other places is all the industrial wars. The industrialization in Europe led to the wars in Europe being much more destructive, right? On the environment, on humans, on everything. So now there was huge cannons and machine guns. This was the machine age. So there were, of course, machine guns. For example, in Africa, Stanley, this fellow you're reading about in the book, he's the one who kind of came up with this whole safari look in which you have this big old hat with like the mosquito net. Stanley said, the best invention is the American Winchester repeating rifle if you want to go and conquer new territories. And this is it. It was Winchester Company was based out of New England, and the owner of the Winchester factory he wasn't a gunsmith. He didn't personally know how to put guns together, but he was really good at bringing people together who did. So he was a great manager of people. So another example of the Industrial Revolution just being the result of a lot of teamwork. And the old saying was the Winchester repeating rifle was the rifle that won the US West, right? So helped defeat Native Americans, helped the British defeat India, and for the example of the Belgian Congo, helped the Congolese Force Publique defeat Africans, right? It was, you might have heard of the 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre in the upper Midwest on the Wounded Knee Reservation. Here are US soldiers using repeating rifles, right? That shot out a lot of lead really fast, and it led to the massacre of over 300, mostly women and children. Same thing in Africa, right? You could have a small number of European colonists fighting a large number of Africans, but with innovative tools like this, they were able to defeat a lot of them. So when we talked about how the Spanish could not defeat the Mapuche, right? And it took a long, long time because they didn't have the technological advantage over the Mapuche. Now, by the 1800s, Europeans did have technological advantages over non-industrialized peoples. What's more, because some Europeans were selling these guns to make a profit to Africans, in 1890, various European politicians and diplomats got together in Europe and did something called the Brussels Convention, and they prohibited the sale of new guns to Africans, right? If you want to sell guns to Africans, you could only sell those old-timey muskets that only shot one at a time, and you had to reload them. It took a long time. So this is arms control, right? The European colonists under new imperialism are controlling the sale of arms in order that they have the good ones. And again, I think this image is important because it shows how Europeans didn't do it alone. They had African allies, right, shooting and fighting other Africans. And my last example is that in 1879, at this famous battle in what's called the Zulu Wars, in Britain, in South Africa, Britain was the colonial power in South Africa. You had 150 British troops, right, versus 1,400 Zulus. And these Zulu warriors did not have guns. They had spears and they had these shields, but they could not match the firepower of the British. Okay, and it was a rout for the British. In other words, the British won this battle in South Africa. Okay, that is the end of my lecture, and I hope you understand a little bit better, because I think in chapter 3 of the book, he's going to talk about how these technological innovations of the Industrial Revolution made this possible. Okay.